Okay, welcome everybody to the release webinar for the Identity Server version 10.0. It's a big milestone release in the history of the company and the product. And with me today, I have Renato, our chief engineer, and Luis, one of our core engineers, who will be with me and discussing the features and fixes we've done in this release. My name is Jakob Ideskog. I'm the CTO at Curity. We have built a lot of stuff this time. I'm very excited to be sharing this now, and we'll start with the highlights as usual, and then we'll dive into the details of both the enhancements and the fixes. If you have questions, shoot them throughout, and we'll discuss and talk about that now that we have a lot of experts on the call here. So first off, this has been a feature requested by many customers, and it is quite exciting to be able to share this now, the OpenTelemetry support in the server. And Luis has been working on this feature and knows a lot about it, so I thought it was a good idea that he would do a quick demo to show what this actually is. So Luis, do you want to just give a brief overview of what OpenTelemetry is and then go about and show the demo? I'll let you share the screen.
Sure. Thank you, Jakob. I'll share my screen here quickly. So OpenTelemetry is all about observability. We, in this release, as Jakob said, we integrated it with the Curity Identity Server, some parts of it, which I'll mention just after. So I'll do a quick demo of how this of the results this integration can produce and what insights you can take from it. So there's a new section on the general system setup page here on our administration UI to configure OpenTelemetry. Here I already have a predefined setup where OpenTelemetry is enabled, and I also added here a configuration setting from many you can add to actually say that traces, one of the aspects of OpenTelemetry, so traces produced by the server, should be exported out of the server to a observability backend using the OpenTelemetry protocol, which is one of the possibilities defined by OpenTelemetry. The options you see here, they are actually just standard options defined by the OpenTelemetry configuration specs and the OpenTelemetry Java SDK. And Curity configures that SDK with the settings you put here, so that you can have full flexibility. By default, telemetry data is not exported out of Curity Identity Server, so the server will just consider incoming trace context from HTTP headers and add it to logs, but it will not produce any traces or span data and export it out of the server itself. But by enabling this setting here, by enabling the OTLP exporter, the server will actually start exporting this data. So with this minimal setup, you can already see two things that I'm going to demo right after, with a simple client credentials request that I'm going to do. This configuration I have is just that for this particular client, OAuth client I'm using here, the client secret is validated using a credential manager in the system, which in turn contacts backing API to validate the credentials. This is to illustrate that Curity can also call into outbound services while propagating the trace context. So that's what I want to illustrate. So I'll do this simple request here. You'll see that there's client authentication. And the most important thing to note is that there is a trace parent header, which could be the trace context that a consuming application has. For example, the client application running somewhere has this trace context ongoing, and it sends it to Curity as the current or the parent trace context for Curity to consider.
Luis, can you make it a little bit bigger? I'm having trouble seeing it.
Sure. Is it better now?
Yeah. Now I can read it. Thanks.
Cool. So as I was saying, this trace parent is sent to Curity so that Curity can consider it for its own telemetry context that is being established for the request. And one thing we can immediately see, this first part here is the trace ID on the trace parent header. One thing we can immediately see if I search the server logs that I have running here on the side is that this trace ID is immediately visible in the logs. So there's a new key that you can configure from the log context to actually get the trace IDs in the logs. So that it's easy to search for using the trace ID that the client had or the consuming application had, the caller application had in the first place, to also search for it on Curity logs so that you get an end-to-end visibility of all the related logs for the same trace.
Yeah, that's extremely useful. And I think, isn't it so that you can also have the, intermediate nodes like a gateway or something participate in this chain as well?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I didn't add it here, but you can also have the span ID. Spans are the building blocks of traces on OpenTelemetry. And Curity produces, it's I think a good thing to say here, that Curity produces a top level span for its own request processing. And then it also produces other spans in other situations, namely in outbound HTTP requests, which is what I actually want to show next. Here on the side, I have Jagger running, which is an observability backend, one possible one that I chose for this demo. And here we already have the traces that Curity exported to Jagger, and Jagger is showing them to us in a way that we can look at it in a more understandable way. So what we can see here is that Curity participated in producing a couple of spans to participate in the trace. There's a top level span here for Curity request processing in this request to the token endpoints. We can also see some of the things that Curity did during request processing, namely it did a successful verification using a credential manager, because as I mentioned, the client is authenticated via a credential manager. Then client authentication was considered successful and access tokens and delegations were issued because this was a client credentials request. Another interesting thing that we can see here, as I was just mentioning, is that the trace context is also propagated on outbound HTTP requests that Curity does. And Curity creates a span for those outbound requests. In this particular case, the credential manager is using a backing API to validate the credentials. And this API is running on my localhost 7777 port. And this span illustrates or represents the outgoing request for credential validation. So here we could see that Curity did a post request to this endpoint to actually validate the credentials for the client. If this API itself was also instrumented using OpenTelemetry, it could also get the trace context from the HTTP request headers that Curity sends, and could also itself push new spans to the telemetry backend. And here, under this one, we could see other spans that the backing API itself produced. In the same way,
very cool.
As you were saying before, if there was an API gateway before Curity that also publishes this telemetry data, we would see it span here above the one produced by Curity.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see the power of what you can do and what you can see with this, and how this also completes and adds to the already large number of ways that you can monitor and view what's going on in the product. So combined with the logs in this case, the events, the alarms, the node status server, the Prometheus metrics, and now OpenTelemetry, I mean, there is nothing that should be hidden from whoever runs Curity on what's going on and where does time go and which service does what. So I think this is an extremely powerful addition to that. Great work on this, Luis. I know you've been spending quite some effort on this part here, so thank you. So let's dive further then. That was the bigger topic first, but we have some more. We've added the new data source. It's been a while since we did that, but now we added MongoDB, which is a NoSQL database, and it is supported fully, which means all the DApp interfaces, all the various storage types that we have can be pointed at a Mongo instance or cluster, and it will work. It's a nice and fast and resilient database. So we hope that we'll see some usage of that. Some interesting pieces of this type of databases, and specifically Mongo, is that they also have auto cleanup structures for certain types of data in there. So they're quite nice when it comes from a maintenance perspective. So feel free to give us feedback on that and the OpenTelemetry part. Another thing is we have added a complete new SDK piece, which is the applications, the ability to build applications in the SDK. So for those of you who've worked with a server for a while, you know we added the applications profile not too long ago. And the only application that existed in there, and that still does out of the box, is the token handler application. But you can now, if you have the applications license with the SDK, you can build your own applications if you need to. And these are sort of general purpose things if you may need, which sometimes can be extremely useful in a product like this, that you have some obscure little thing that needs to happen and you need to build a request response thing around that. The applications is the place to do that. We have more applications in the works that will come and be shipped with the product. But the SDK is now open so that you can build your own here. So I know some partners have been working on this and trying this out for us also before we went live with this. So it's a very, very good addition. Another thing, we've expanded our GraphQL management APIs with a completely brand new way of dealing with token data called the authorized grants API. So it's a way to manage the grants, and a grant is an OAuth concept of the relationship between a resource owner and the authorization server and the client. Essentially, a delegation, we called it before, and we still do, but the delegation is more fine-grained. The grant is, have you ever had access in this sort of triplet, the user accessed, a client that accessed various things. So what you can do with this is essentially revoke and view what access has been provided for a particular user. You can't manage the particular tokens. That's not the idea with this API. It's to manage the overall. So you can wipe out a user's access or a client's access to a particular set of data. It's a very good API. And more to come in that area. Another thing that I thought you could mention a few things about here, Renato, is something we're working on, and we're kind of sneak peeking out a few details around this in this release, which is the new throttling framework for sending emails.
Yeah, so this is, like on the face of it, it's a small feature. It's basically like we already support throttling in the email plugin, authenticator plugin, sorry, email sender plugin, and it's a little bit limited because it was based on keeping state via the session, the user session. That's obviously not ideal, and we have been thinking of ways to improve that kind of thing. And yeah, this is the first part of it. The throttling now is more powerful because it can keep state globally. Unfortunately, for the first release, it will require configuring a data source that supports buckets, because we will store the data that's necessary for throttling in a bucket data source. But in the future, we are going to remove that restriction. We will be able to keep it in a memory database, basically. And this is going to be integrated with something which we are still kind of designing, but it's going to be a much more powerful threat detection mechanism, where we are able to score requests according to certain factors. For example, in this case, the throttler itself is a very basic mechanism for that, right? It just like detects like that a certain client IP, for example, is trying to send more than usual emails to users than you wouldn't expect to be the case. That affects the score of that request, and we may decide, based on several factors, that this is this is not looking like a legit flow, and we may, allow in the future running certain actions or things like that increase the security of the users. So yeah.
Exactly, and that's why this is a small but really important update, because it is part of this new subsystem that we're building and adding piece by piece now to the product. Very interesting, and the mentioning there of the database that will come in a release pretty soon, that you won't be able to, or you won't have to set the backing database, but the nodes will distribute that data between themselves without that. So
we still support the old throttling mechanism, and you can easily migrate to this new system if you want to. But we recommend that you do, because, like I said, it's going to integrate with our future systems for detecting fraud and other threats. So it's a great way to already start using that, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. So let's run through the list. It's quite a big release, so we'll move a bit fast on some of these at least, and do shoot questions or so if you have any. Some web UI updates in the beginning here. There was we've added an escape key that can close the full screen of the new authentication workflow designer that you have on the authenticator page. So that's just a nice UX update to that. And some other UX updates to scroll to the right element on the database clients part of the general page of OAuth when you're working with that. Another nice small update is the warning message on the audit. If the audit backing is down, you can configure the JDBC to be used for backing the audit log. Now it's a much more clear and concise message for that if there's a failure on that end. This one is something that I think some of us were surprised that we didn't have, but we now added that in the script action, you can use a web service client. You can configure one to use in the procedure there if you need to make external calls from the script. Many times, once your script starts to get advanced, we recommend that you actually write the plugin instead, because that's easier to maintain over time. But of course, sometimes it is pretty simple, but you still need to make an HTTP call. So that's now been added. Some other updates to actions is that in the conditional MFA action, we've added a flag so that you can decide if you want to allow SSO to be used or not when that factor is being determined, so that you can decide if you always want to prompt the user with that, or if it's okay that it slipped through if it's already used that factor recently. For OptimMFA, we added a small update to the templates, namely a variable called registered factors. So if you want to change that template on what it looks like, you can use that variable to list the factors that are registered already. And the reset password action, I think you were the one updating this one, right, Luis? Support scenarios where credential access only and no accounts.
Yeah, I was.
It's part of a bigger thing, right?
Exactly. It's part of work that we started a couple of releases ago already, or many releases ago, actually, to be able to better support storage of account data and credential data in a separate way. And some of the bits in the server were still requiring that you configure account managers for when they are used only for credential management. This, unfortunately, was one of them that we didn't have time before to remove this limitation, let's call it. And now it's possible to use this action in a scenario where you actually don't manage accounts, but just manage credentials.
Yeah, that's good. I think we have some more of those tickets coming up here we should talk about. The Bank ID Authenticator has a small go back to application button now if it fails. It's been updated. And then there are 2 updates on this that are breaking, where we now change to use the version 6 API, which is the only one they really support these days by default. So if you set up something, that's what it will use. And we've also changed the templates. We introduced a version 2 set of templates a while back, and now those are used by default. So if you still want to use the version 1 templates, you have to actively make sure you're picking that in your template configurations.
Yeah, but I think it's worth mentioning that even though they are breaking changes, they have been a long time coming. So hopefully everybody's prepared for that already.
Yeah, a good point. Good point. We already mentioned the threat detection framework there, and there's a little small template update to the HTML form where we didn't have an ID attribute in the password field. That's been added. And then we have some more. On the OpenID Connect authenticator, you can now allow it to add a refresh token to the context attributes. So OpenID Connect, obviously, it runs an OpenID Connect flow to another IDP, and the result of that can be passed on, including the refresh token, which wasn't possible before. And another update is that you can set the redirect URI to be configurable. And this is when we go up and it redirects back, which obviously should go to us. So that wasn't configurable before because that path is kind of decided by how the server is set up. But in some cases, you kind of facade that. You have something else in front that then forwards it to us. And if you do that, you can configure the redirect URI outside and then make sure you still forward it to the right place, which is the redirect endpoint of the authenticator. So that's now possible to do. Could be useful also in migration scenarios and stuff if you have other servers before and you want to move to this. Another one is that we have changed the default behavior of the authenticator to reject a signed user info response that doesn't have the issuer or audience claims properly set. So when we get the user info data to know who logged in, that data can be signed, and that signature or that JOT needs to have certain properties on them that we were a bit relaxed on before, but we've strictened that up to strictly follow the spec. There's no real security issue in this area. It's more of a be sure we do it by the book here.
And I think some famous ones do not have these claims, right? And I think so it might be necessary to configure the server to allow that to be missing.
Yeah, for sure. And that's probably how it came to be in the beginning, even.
Yeah.
The SAML authenticator was updated similarly as OpenID Connect, where you could set the redirect URL on OpenID. You can set the ACS URL on SAML to be something else than what the server thinks it is. Same scenario there. On the TOTP authenticator, it now automatically goes to the register page if there is no device authenticated, registered before. And then we have an update here of a subdependency to the LDAP data source of Mina that was updated. We did send out an email before Christmas. I think it was around a potential vulnerability that was striking the internet. We were not susceptible, and we still are not. This update has to do with that, obviously, but there was no use, and we had other security mechanisms in place. So, but we still make sure we're up to date on all our dependencies. The JSON data source has been updated also to support post and not only get when working with attribute data access. I know some customers have requested that, so good addition here. And we added Mongo, but we're also dropping Cockroach DB as we have not seen any usage of that or requests for that in a really long time. So we decided that it's time. We deprecated this a while back, and now it's dropped. So if we missed something here, do let us know, but we have not heard anything from anyone, and we think that it's a good time to do that.
Yeah, this database, it was simple for us to support, but on the other hand, it cost us quite a lot maintaining all the tests running. We do have a full test suite that runs with every single data source that we support. And
Yeah.
that's the main reason we decided to drop it. But yeah, we'll see if anybody complains. Who knows? Maybe we can review that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point actually that you make there, because on GitHub we have a few other data sources as well which work, but the ones we ship we do run all of our, I think, 13,000 tests with to make sure they are functioning as expected and so on. So when we support it, we really support it. Luis, I think we talked about this briefly. Maybe you want to pick this one up, the data source deprecation here.
Sure. Yes. So again, as I said earlier, we have been doing for many releases now work on the credential management side of things to better organize the databases and how credential data access is done with in a more separated way when compared to accounts, also to account data. And part of that effort was during the 9x release cycle, we introduced some schema changes to the JDBC data source, and the companion configuration modes, we called it, for credential data access to keep retrocompatibility and allow customers to migrate from the old schema to the new schema. So it was a long process. It involved changes on the schemas, but also on many types on the SDK, that the types that are actually used to implement data sources, also for other custom plugins that people out there can be implementing for Curity. And now it's time to deprecate the old modes and the legacy schema, the legacy database schema for JDBC. So if you're still using that, it's time to migrate. It's good to go through the release notes on this release, of course, but there will be links for the relevant releases of the 9x cycle where the main changes were done. And it's time to move, because probably on the next major we will stop supporting this old schema completely.
Yeah, good point. So credentials in accounts table, that's actually the way it used to be. That's the old worry. Credential migration is something we added to allow you to sort of softly migrate, and then standard is the new mode. And like you say, probably in version 11 we'll drop those. So good to look at that if you haven't already. A lot of benefits on that also. A lot of the new features will actually require this for you to be able to use.
Namely credential policies.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jacob. Namely credential policies, which we added a few releases back as well. They require this new mode. So
yeah, exactly. We already do it like that. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, go for it. MongoDB is dropped, like we said. We also dropped CentOS, the Docker image
dropped.
support.
MongoDB
was added.
Did you say dropped?
Yeah, I did say dropped. A lot of dropping now. No, we added Mongo, but we're dropping CentOS. We don't have any usage of that. It's not an image that we see any demand for. So if you need CentOS, you can still build that using our Docker files that you find on GitHub. We've updated some documentation around multi-tenancy with more clarifications on the in the upgrade guides. We also took a decision to revert some removals that we did in the UI builder. We had some command line options there that we removed. We didn't think those were actually relevant anymore, but turns out they were. Some customers asked us to put those back, so we did that.
We were trying to simplify it a little bit, but turns out those options were being used, so we'll have to keep them forever, probably.
Yeah. And then maybe you want to take this one, Renato.
Sure. So I think Luis just mentioned that we are making quite a few changes there to the credential data sources, or how we manage credentials via the data sources in there. And one of the reasons is that we want to provide pretty powerful features like these, like managing credential policies. And what we did now was we added support for handling the state of the credential policies that you configure for the user credentials via GraphQL. And this GraphQL API it's not an independent API. It's just part of the existing user management GraphQL API, but we added operations where you can query for the states of the credential policies for a particular user. So for example, if a user has tried to authenticate with the wrong password many times, they get logged out, and then you will be able to see that in the user information via this new operation. And you will be able even to, for example, clear the state so that you unlock the user. And this is it's possible to manage all of the credential rule. I'm trying to find the correct term here. Luis, help me, please.
The rule states, right?
The rule
Credential-
state, yes. The rule
Credential
state.
rule state.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to say. So you can manage the credential rules states, all of the rules that exist in the server that keep states.
Yeah, that's good.
So,
And this is this working in the dashboard already, or is that coming?
so the dashboards, our dashboards uses this GraphQL API to allow you to see to perform these operations, but not in 10.0. Unfortunately, we missed the train, but it's coming in 10.1 because it's already being developed by the UI team.
Excellent. But the API is there if you have other integrations using that. So take a look at that. We talked about the granted authorizations already. We did some other updates like allow a new way of sorting database clients by client ID in the query on that. And next one here, multi-part image embedding, Luis. What is this about?
Yeah, so this was something that was requested for scenarios where emails need to have their full content available offline. And one possibility is to use multi-part messages with embedded content, namely images for that. So now it's possible via the SDK services that we have to request that the server sends an email to say that you also want to embed some content. Of course, it depends on the support provided by the actual email sender plugin, but the built-in one for SMTP supports this using multi-part messages.
Good. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good addition.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing to try to use this on emails because from what we heard, there is quite a few privacy conscious email clients that will not load images or other resources, and that's the main reason I believe that you probably want to have this inlined resources like this, like or part of the same email message.
Yeah, that's a good point. We talked about the applications plugins already. Obviously, they're in the SDK. And here, these two here, Luis, are related to what you were talking about, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's the SDK counterpart of what I just said before.
Right. So we now deprecated the old version of that, just like we did with the settings in the DApp. And the types in the SDK are also stable. They're not experimental anymore. So that's great to see all of that coming together nicely. We did a small update a release ago or two about making it possible to have the scopes string sent as an array if you issue JOTs with custom issuers. We had a debate back and forth about the default scope. In Curity, the default scope is the empty string. And the initial decision was to send the default scope as an empty string in the array, but we changed that actually to say it's an empty array. It makes more sense from a JSON perspective to do it like that. So small update. We also improved the CORS support slightly on the token endpoint. So Curity supports CORS in a lot of different ways in different places, but on the token endpoint, where you get the token, it only really supports CORS if you have a public client that is requesting the token, the single page application typically. Now, those weren't possible to pre-flight before, but now they are. So it also does the full pre-flight procedure or support staff procedure with the options called before you actually make the post. I don't remember exactly why we needed this, to be honest, but I think there were some agents that did this. Yeah, please do.
It's kind of related to the OpenTelemetry things because you may require trace context headers to be sent if you want to propagate
that's
context
right.
headers.
That's right.
And those will no longer be considered simple requests from the course point of view. So you need the pre-flight for those to work. So this came up during that work.
That's right. A good one. Yeah, you can't send custom headers if you want to avoid the pre-flight. Good. Another one that shouldn't affect anyone, but is a change we did was when you use happy, we sign the happy tokens using a symmetric internal key instead of an external asymmetric key pair. There was no real reason to have it asymmetrically. We issue the token and we verify the token. So it makes a lot of sense for this. This avoids confusion. So if anyone else were to get that token and try to look at it, they couldn't accidentally verify it if someone had configured the same key to be used for that token as other things. So it's really, obviously, you should check audience and other things when verifying a token. Not only can I validate the signature, but sometimes mistakes are made, and this avoids mistakes in other ends. So it's a small, nice little update. We also added some Whimsy support, and Whimsy is still super drafty specifications from the new working group in IETF for workload identities. And it's about how to get a workload to exchange or get the token from Curity, given a workload identity that is provisioned by the system. We've added capabilities so that you can configure the way we review or validate the client assertion to accept the client assertion that looks more like a workload identity jot. Those have a few different properties at a few different fields, and those aren't fully compatible with the way OAuth thinks a client assertion should look like. So now if you turn this on a client, you can actually use workload issued identities to obtain tokens from Curity very easily. Very cool update. I think we'll see more in this area in the future. Renato, I think you were touching on this one, right? The credential rule for password resets.
Yes, exactly. So as we added the API, we also continue to improve the support for defining credential rules. So this is a new rule that we added that allows an admin to force a user to reset their password. For now, the only way you can actually use this is you need to use the new GraphQL API to set state of the rule for a particular user. But in the future, we will also have this in the dashboard, our dashboard, so that you can just do that more easily there as well.
Yeah, it's a good one. So you can just say, hey, next time you come, please change password. So we use the rules framework for this, even though it perhaps doesn't sound like a rule, but it is a rule framework thing. OpenTelemetry we talked about, messaging services in the Twilio SMS sender. This is a pretty nuanced update, I would say, but it allows you to configure a messaging service SID instead of a phone from phone number. And in Twilio, when sending SMSs, you can then, I think, if I remember correctly, switch based on the country you're in, because in some countries you can't send like from Curity as the name, it should be a phone number, and in others you can, and then you can have a switch in there to make sure you're getting to the right place. You're nodding, Luis, so it sounds like I'm on the right track.
Yes, that's exactly it. So Twilio already provides that sort of flexibility when using messaging services. So now you can say, please use messaging service when using the Curity plugin.
Yeah, nice. Small but good update, I think, for certain cases, especially if you're on a multi-region type setup. And we did a small change in the token handler around the require custom header. And this is a small security mechanism in the token handler where it sends a custom header in there on certain requests or most requests. We didn't have this as default required in the original configuration when we released it. And then once we introduced this, we sort of didn't want to break the configuration, obviously. But now we do because it's a major version and it is a security mechanism we think always should be there. So if you're not using that, what do you have to do, Luis? You have to update your application slightly as well when you turn this on, right? Or when this is turned on in version 10.
Either you would turn this off, but it's not recommended. So the alternative is to actually send this header from the SPA.
Yeah, and this is in our docs, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So check our docs if you don't have this on today. So you make sure if you're using our SDK, I think you're probably safer. Finally, before we get into the corrections part, we have also done a change in the credential handling on account update and deletion, which is breaking change. And this also goes into what we have been talking about a lot, that we split credentials from accounts. We now consider them completely separate, which means you can have completely separate data sources for them, which is useful in many cases. But it means that in the SCIM, in the user management profile, you can't update the account username or delete accounts fully if you don't have the new, if you don't use the new JDBC standard mode, essentially. So you need to be migrating there if you want to use these features. We're now blocking that otherwise because it can lead to data inconsistencies.
Jakob, just one small addition, actually, just as maybe a wrap up for all these topics, that all this also applies to custom data source plugins that customers may have developed. So if they're using the credential data access provider interface on the SDK, that one is now deprecated and there is a new one to replace it since 9x. So also in those cases, it's really recommended to upgrade the plugins, and the migration should be really simple. It's described on the upgrade guide. But it will then allow for all these deprecation scenarios that we've been described to be avoided.
Yeah, good point. Good point. I think especially the credentials step is something that some customers have built because it is very simple to use and build. But like you said, it's also pretty simple to go to the new one. It's not that different, but it has some important changes in there. Good one. Okay, so let's rush through the corrections and guys, stop me if there's something to point out more particularly. Admin UI, we had a few fixes here that the authenticator detail page broke in some cases when you switched profile. The events were missing. If you created an event listening procedure, we didn't list all possible events in that comment that is in that. We've now updated that to contain the missing ones. And in a few cases, we had a federated login fail to the admin UI. When the ID token came, there was a decoding error in certain cases. That's been fixed. Also in the admin UI, we had a misleading message when you enabled the database clients, where it kind of indicated that you didn't have the right license, even if you did, or which part of the license was missing and so forth. That has been updated and clarified. The overview page also had where you have those cards that show the nodes that are active in the system. It showed some incorrect information on the service role, which has been fixed. And the procedure editor had a bug in it and made it not function properly in all cases. This has been updated and fixed properly as well. Some stacked modal cases as well, where they don't nest in the proper direction, it's been fixed, and some truncation for the switch case, the switch action in the workflow designer. So that's the UI, and then we have the authentication API, or HAPI. It is no longer using the legacy depop setting on the, which part was it? Internal client, exactly. So in some cases where you run the internal client for login, it didn't use the new nonce implementation that was there. There is still a setting where you can run a sort of a legacy mode that doesn't use that. We added a nonce setting to avoid clock drift problems, which can occur especially on mobile platforms. Not as common on web platforms, to be honest. So that's probably why we haven't noticed this. It's not really a security issue per se in this update here. Speaking of nonces, though, we did have an interesting bug showing up on iOS 18.2, where we failed to decode the nonce that came back from an external browser flow after an update in Safari. And this has been fixed in the server. If you are experiencing this and you're not yet on 10, I believe there is a fix also out for 9.7 on this. The Happy also had a problem with a mismatch between the SDK and the server on confidential clients. So if you have the fallback mechanism configured, there were some issues in some cases where that didn't work properly because it sent credentials and we interpreted it as it shouldn't. But that has been fixed, so you can have these two working in tandem. You can have a happy mobile client supporting full fallback and already from the beginning, and then falling back only when it needs to. So there were a few issues around that. We had an issue with bank ID that it stopped polling after 30 seconds with the new version of the templates been fixed. And here is one on the authorization managers when using Skim or GraphQL, but I think the error was in Skim. If you use the attribute authorization manager, which is a really powerful one, you can filter, it will filter out all the attributes you're not allowed to see. And if all are filtered out, you received a 500, which obviously isn't the right error in that case. The claim email verified was not correctly calculated if you configured the account manager to say username is email. There's a setting on the account manager that kind of merges the two and says email is username always. When you did that, you didn't get the right value of the email claim. Email verified claim, it would always reserve to false no matter if the account was activated or not. So that has been fixed. We had a bug on the bucket data source for MySQL where it would return empty attributes even on unsuccessful upserts, and that was not the way it should have been done. So that has been fixed. This one, I think you were digging in recently, Renato. Don't remember really what that was.
Yeah, this I need to think now because as you can see, it's quite a lot of tickets.
We did a lot this release.
Hard to memorize everything, to be honest.
Oh yeah, we had an issue if you enabled OTP, which is then a TOTP on the account activation. So in the email, it sends an OTP for account activation. When you had that enabled, it actually broke certain flows on the OAuth server
Right.
in the server, which was a strange error that we, for some reason, didn't see for a while. So I don't think anyone has actually had the combination that was required for this to happen, but it's been fixed.
This is just the TOTP account verifier, which was recently added.
Yeah,
not so recent. I think it was 8.2 that or 9.2, right? 9.2. 9. Yeah, so it was relatively new, but yeah, if you configured that, it would break backends flows like client credentials because it requires a session. So yeah, we just fixed that because obviously we want that to work.
Yeah. The mutual TLS by proxy OAuth client authentication should always be using the proxy password as is. So this changes before it actually could modify the password to if there was URL unsafe characters in there, but that's not the behavior it should have. But it has been fixed. Similarly, the OAuth client that we use when you send HTTP, well, not that we use, but when you send HTTP basic authentication, it should do URL decoding of that, which it didn't at all cases. So in the spec, OS spec, it clearly states that. Obviously, this is not very often an issue, so I don't think many people have run into that, but do note that's a breaking change. The device authorization endpoint, i.e. the device flow, returned a non-standard parameter in the error response, which was called error code. That has been removed since that's not part of the standard. We also had a few of the procedures that wasn't possible to load from the file system. As you know, you can put them in the file system in a certain folder hierarchy in the init folder, and some of them weren't loaded, and that's fixed. We had a missing event for device deletion when using SCIM that has been added and updated. And we have also a bug in the SDK request handler that didn't implement content type negotiation properly. That has been fixed, and it also supports the Kotlin annotations properly. And finally, when using PAR, there could be cases where a secret could end up in the original query string, which then would have been persisted for a short time in the session, and that has been fixed so that that should not happen. That is it. Quite a release, I would say. And these are only the tickets that we put in the release notes. So it's quite a massive undertaking this time. I'm very happy to see it out in the wild. Do we have any questions? No. So I think that's it. Do reach out to us if you have questions or thoughts or comments on this release, and we're happy to take any feedback that you have. Thanks, Luis and Renato, for joining me.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.